One of the unique things about Metro Analytics is it was one of our owners doing doctoral studies in history when she bought into the company. And she began learning about transportation planning and particularly about the bipartisan infrastructure law and its strong emphasis on historical equity, and began to realize that there's not a lot of qualitative expertise in the transportation sector. When you compare, for example, transportation to public health or to some other areas of policy, we don't have as much historical and ethnographic expertise. And therefore, when we look at equity, we often have blind spots that we don't understand evidence-based ways to look at our history and to understand the planning that we're doing and the role that it has when we consider equity. So in response to this, Metro Analytics invested in a body of research which we refer to as the historical equity action lens. It is a set of methods and techniques that can be readily demonstrated in any given planning process to diagnose where today's costs and performance and deficiencies in the transportation system are linked to inequitable past decisions, but not just for understanding the past, but understanding what the deficiencies actually mean, what they tell us about the life of a community, and how we can remedy them. So it applies evidence-based methods when we're diagnosing when, how, and why the cumulative harm of an individual generation can be caused by traumatic experiences or historical trauma that has happened over time. And that can be trauma that has happened from natural events, resilience type things like hurricanes, floods, tornadoes, human events like the construction of a highway that has bisected a community or a railroad, sometimes environmental trauma that has sometimes happened where people have been subject to air quality, noise, gentrification, dislocation. All of these things happen in communities and they affect the impact of the transportation system on the community. And these things do not show up in heat maps. They don't show up in travel demand models. They do not show up in typical demography. They live in the lived experience of the community. They live in historical archives. They live in cultural knowledge in a community. So how do you operationalize that? How do you actually get that into a plan to say we can create value by doing something about it? So HEAL is a body of research that aims to do that in a very practical way. Apply the lessons of history to target new solutions and heal communities that are burdened by these legacy costs, and offer new historically informed paradigms for prioritization and decision making to prevent the recurrence of inequities from the past decisions and based on older planning and policy paradigms, and also to foster the formation of durable coalitions that can implement and safeguard ongoing achievement of inclusive and equitable transportation system. So what does all that really mean? Well, what it means is that we're moving from a NEPA paradigm where people would say, well, why is the history relevant to my project? I'm an engineer, I'm going to design an interchange, and you tell me why the history matters, and I'll do something about it. Well, the question to be asking is really more a question of how is your interchange relevant to history? Because history is going to happen whether you build your interchange or not. History happened when we built the interchanges before, and we can't control it. So we start asking the question, well, what role does my project play in the history that's already happening? As a planner, in this picture, we often think of ourselves as sitting at the beginning of the arc of history. In this picture, the planner is looking out to 2050 or 2100 as though the world starts today and I can take my existing conditions and I can do scenario planning for the future, which is all well and good, except for the fact that that planner is not at the beginning. That planner is in the middle. And all of these things are already happening. The arc of history is already going on today. Climate change, the construction and use of the interstate system, the evolution of social justice concerns, cultural change, urbanization, migration, the digital economy. All of these things are already happening. All of these things have been happening for decades, in some cases for centuries. And if planners don't understand, don't have a practical method for understanding where they really stand in this process, then we are destined to repeat the same mistakes over again and maybe even engage in interventions that don't understand that stream into which we dip our toe every time that we touch our built environment. Historically, equity action lens is intended to create tools for looking at the entire arc of history and finding our place in it. So what kind of things do we do if we render a HEAL service in a planning process, in a planning study, corridor study, long-range plan? What are we doing? We're doing trauma diagnosis. We're using evidence-based methods, constructing archives to understand, okay, what have been the major trends, events that have basically imposed costs that we can see showing up in our transportation system today, that people are still talking about and that people understand. How can we diagnose that trauma? By looking at the culture in the historical archive. Historically based metrics of cost, benefits, and accountable progress. Many cases in choosing what to measure, it's often been based on what data we have instead of what the actual experience of the community has been. So by constructing an archive, we can pose historically informed questions about what it means to perform and what it means to get better. And we can actually benchmark things that maybe we didn't think we could benchmark before. Another is equitable prioritization methods. When we change how we define needs, when we change our performance criteria, when we change what performance even means based on the lived experience of the community, we have a wider set of metrics to use to prioritize our investments. Also, we can create durable coalitions for community empowerment and institutional memory. If you undertake a HEAL service, you can create other types of historical and ethnographic knowledge that can live in the community. And every time you go and do a plan, you can draw on that knowledge and add to it. And ultimately, you end up with pragmatic implementation of incremental solutions that build on existing planning and investment processes. So, what are some of the kinds of things that you might get in a HEAL service? Well, one of the things you can get is what's called a synoptic historiography, which is a fancy way of saying that in many cases, if we look at our communities and we look at the plans that we've done over the decades, some areas tend to get studied more than others. Some areas tend to be analyzed more than others, and some areas are notably missing in the archive of all of our plans that we've done over time. Think about, for example, the fact that there are areas in many of our cities that were built before NEPA, that were built before the 1994 Environmental Justice Task Order. Did they ever get the air quality and noise analysis? Did they ever get the environmental justice treatment that some of the newer areas got? They may not have. Is it possible that even when we've collected data, or maybe we've gone and done a lot of different corridor studies and small area studies in some neighborhoods and never been to others? So historiography is really looking at what historical archive do we have? Where have we even looked and not looked? And here we can find some understudied areas, and we can identify some of those areas that qualify the most for some of our funding under the bipartisan infrastructure law. This is a great way to use that funding for things like raised planning grants or areas of persistent poverty grants to go and find those generational opportunities that we have missed. So a synoptic historiography service is a service of professional historians who can go and show us what we've been missing and what we haven't covered in our plans so far. Another thing that we have that's a very powerful service offering is the digital exhibit. A digital exhibit is something that basically can be fun and interactive, but it's just like an exhibit in a museum. But professional historians can take and curate archives to take us back to different times in our history and understand why our infrastructure was developed, what motivated that, and what has changed since then. So, in walking through the exhibit, decision makers and stakeholders alike can come to a new understanding of what performance means in historical context, who, why, and where accounts for the transportation system we see today. And it can really spotlight a lot of the elephants in the room or things that people are uncomfortable talking about because everybody kind of has an opinion and they can be divisive. But yet, when we look at it in an exhibit within its whole context, instead of just arguing about the past, we can actually start to see, okay, now I understand by going to an exhibit. If anyone's ever been to an exhibit and maybe you went to a place and you walk out on the city, you say, okay, now I understand this city, I understand this street, I understand this place when I've had a good exhibit that I didn't before. This is another very important deliverable of the historical equity action lens to have professional historians and ethnographers go into community, create this kind of resource for the planning. Another service offering is what we would call the sunglasses process. And that can be a workshop-based educational process where if you think about it, we all walk around today in 2024 with a pair of blue sunglasses. We live in a world with the internet. We live in a world where, we have cars. We live in a world where people are concerned about climate change. We live in a world that basically we have certain lenses through which we look at the world that are our 2024 lenses. We make assumptions. We look at an interchange. We look at a parking lot. We look at a bus, and it means something to us in 2024. But back in 1924, they did not have blue sunglasses. They had yellow sunglasses. A new building going up had a different meaning then. A streetcar had a different meaning then. Density had a different meaning then. Race had a different meaning then. Someone walking down the street carrying two bags had a different meaning then. And when they were making decisions to build much of what we have today, they were wearing yellow sunglasses. And today we look at it with blue sunglasses, assuming that we know how it should perform or what it does. In a sunglasses exercise, aided by professional historians and ethnographers, we can take you back to 1924 and look at when our infrastructure was built. And then we can take you to 1964 and look at what's happening, look at how it got to where it is. And then we come back to 2024. We don't have blue sunglasses. We don't have yellow sunglasses. We have green sunglasses. We can now see things we didn't before. We can have those aha moments and say, okay, now I understand why everything we've tried to do in this area never worked. Now I understand why people in the community never use this infrastructure the way we intend. Now I understand why we have these complaints that we have. And we begin to see new solutions and new ways of measuring performance. Another thing that we can also do within a HEAL service are observational techniques like photo voice, for example. Give people cameras, have them take pictures of their everyday lives and say, where does it hurt? How do you experience this? What shows up in the pictures and the narratives is a very different way of measuring performance than what happens when you get out a heat map and you map out your benefits and burdens according to census data alone. So another service offering, and perhaps what all of the HEAL service offerings combine into, is an equity booster plan. So an equity booster plan, you can use a BIL raise grant, you can use EDA resources, but an equity booster plan basically says, look at all these plans we have. We have that safety action plan, our long range transportation plan, we have transit plans, we have comprehensive plans. What is missing from these plans? And when we have the HEAL service in front of us, we can start to go through these plans, string them together to say, okay, well, we missed this, we missed that. These are some things that we know now that we didn't. And a booster plan cuts across all those plans and says, okay, here is a subset of new policies and initiatives that are eligible for funding under the BIL that we can use to meet those equity criteria and to greatly improve our community, enhance value in our community. We could be revising the scope of our currently planned projects, particularly those areas that maybe never got the NEPA or environmental justice treatment. We could also identify new projects that we never even thought we needed, and we can find funding for them. And also, we can tie the findings of our HEAL process into our performance measures and our long-range planning so that we don't just look at equity as a distributive matter of trying to make sure that people in this red area of the heat map, that some benefit lands there, but we can look at it over time to say not just across different areas of town, but across different generations and decades, that we start to see things get better for our community in terms that are defined by our historical and cultural awareness. And also we can establish durable coalitions and a booster plan to implement that, to say that it isn't just one agency that implements, but communities can be empowered to implement things collaboratively. So these are things that are offered under the historical equity action lens. Today, they exist in the form of digital exhibits that can be seen online. They exist in the form of new performance indicators and needs assessments that are being done in communities. And it can revolutionize what it means to do planning in this century. So that is the historical equity action lens.